Good morning and welcome to today's CBI at 10 webinar. My name is Kerry Thomas. I'm one of the editors at a news startup called, I should probably stop calling it a startup now, a news publisher called Tortoise. A great pleasure to be here in conjunction with the CBI as ever to talk about yesterday's budget. And I think there are little budgets and there are big budgets, and yesterday felt like me to be one of the bigger ones for a bunch of reasons, I think, because it confirmed that we're on a path for the next few years of, relatively speaking, historically high tax and spending. So the economic philosophy of this government feels different, not only from Conservative governments a generation ago, but actually radically different from even the 2010 to 2015 government. So that feels as if something important has happened there. And then I think there were some big, more short-term calculations it made on inflation, on interest rates, on growth coming down the track, on the scale of the cost of living problems that are there more immediately. So I hope this morning we can spend some time looking at the general economic outlook, and then some of the specific policy choices the Chancellor made on business rates, on R&D, on skills. Are they going to be enough to deal with the long-term growth rate in this country, which the OBR thinks is going to go back to relatively anemic levels quite quickly after this spurt that we're going through at the moment. So that's, I think, what's on the agenda this morning. But as ever, we do want you to help influence the agenda. You can put your comments and thoughts and questions and observations into the chat, then I'll bring those into the conversation as much as we can. It's great for the CBI to know where your concerns are and what you're interested in. So it helps, I think, with the long term, but it certainly helps keep this discussion lively and open. So do fire them in. If you want to put them in anonymously, then just write anon at the top of the whatever you want to say, and we'll deal with that in confidence, of course. We've got a brilliant panel of people with us this morning. We've got Rain Newton-Smith, who is the CBI's chief economist. We've got Yael Selfin, who's chief economist at KPMG, and we've got Dr. Anna Valero, who's senior policy fellow and economist at the London School of Economics. So real firepower in front of us here. Rain, let me begin with you, if I may, as ever. Before we get into some of the sort of more specifics, do you want to give your sort of overview of what the economic outlook the Chancellor ran us through yesterday?
Yeah, so I think, in a way, that is a really positive place to start. So the OBR set out their economic forecast. They now expect growth this year to be about 6.5%, and growth next year of 6%. But as we know, there's still some real challenges for businesses and for our economy that we're all starting to feel through higher inflation. So the OBR expect inflation could peak around 5%, so averaging almost 4% over the course of next year. So quite a significant increase in inflation to what we've been used to in recent times. There are also, as we know, for businesses, big challenges around skill and labor shortages. So I think that's the sort of positive outlook. And actually, if I reflect on where we were, say, a year ago, or even in the March budget time, I think then we were worried about unemployment rising. And I think, again, it's encouraging that the OBR, I think unemployment will only peak out at just over 5%. So it's a very different labour market than we thought we would be facing into. And of course, that reflects some of the very large support that the Chancellor has put in place, working with businesses to help everyone through the pandemic. And I think we also saw the Chancellor make some big decisions about what you were alluding to, that overall sort of tax and spend. This isn't an austerity budget, but I would say that doesn't mean it's going to be easy necessarily for some of the government departments, and I'm sure we'll go on to discuss some of that. He is putting more spending into the economy over the next few years. But I think something that was important that the Chancellor set out was that he said, we know over the forecast, the overall proportion in tax as a share of the overall economy will be at some of its highest levels ever. But the Chancellor has clearly indicated he wants that to come down. So maybe we have reached peak tax. I know many businesses will be pleased to hear that, because we know we've got very large increases in corporation tax on the cards, and also we saw the increases in national insurance. And of course, much of that is to pay for some of the programs we've had during the pandemic, but also some important changes around social care and health, to give some examples.
Okay, and Rain, no webinar is complete without a dog these days, so
I know, I'm really sorry. It's half term. The teenage daughter was supposed to be looking after the dog.
Don't worry. From a business specific point of view, what were the main things that caught your eye yesterday?
So look, there's so many things that I and our team, supported by all our members, have been working really tirelessly, I think, in terms of what we wanted to see from the Chancellor. I'll probably start, first of all, with business rates, because that is an area of taxation where there were some important decisions, and we were supposed to see this fundamental review of business rates. So it really was an opportunity. And I think we did see some good improvements. So we're moving to revaluations every 3 years as opposed to every 5, and in some cases it's been every 7, and that disjoint has just caused so many problems in terms of how properties are valued, and therefore what that means for businesses in hospitality, retail, manufacturing, you name it, in terms of their tax liabilities. He also said he would freeze the overall multiplier for another year, basically taking us to the next valuation. And that's important, particularly in a time when inflation is high, because business rates go up in line with CPI unless that universal basic rate is frozen. And then I think importantly, he extended some relief to some of the hard hit sectors. So smaller businesses in retail, hospitality and leisure will have a 50% discount on their business rates bill. That's capped at £100,000 per business. So obviously that's primarily geared at small to medium sized businesses. But I know from the conversations I've had, that will make a big difference if you're a hotel in Cumbria and it's taken a while for, you've obviously been hit by the pandemic. I think that will provide a safety net. And then I think in terms of fundamental reforms, he did a few things. So looking at exempting renewable energy from the overall business rates. And finally, if you improve your property, so say you're a hotel and you build, extend it, he will give relief for 12 months from a higher business rates bill, and that's something that we advocated for. And he called it the sort of CBI policy around business rates. So I think there were some improvements, but it wasn't a sort of radical shift. But he is going to do some consultations on online sales tax and also on transition relief. So there's still more to come on that. And I think the other area I would just mention on the spending side, there were a lot of announcements around R&D and innovation, and the Chancellor has said he will let spending come to 2.4% of GDP. That's a long-term aim. Now that overall, when he will reach that, he pushed that to the right by 1 year, but actually the overall volume of spending on innovation will go up by 50% over the next few years. So that's a huge increase, and it is primarily focused on Innovate UK and on some of the very commercial and business oriented spending for R&D. So I think that actually was really welcome, but I think there's still more to be done on the areas of skills in particular. So I think there were some important positives, but also I think we've overall felt it wasn't quite bold enough to really lift that productivity and growth over the longer term. And I think the OBR forecasts reflect that. We still see pretty anemic growth over the medium term.
Yeah. Okay. Rain, that's fantastic. We'll come back to you on Sean a load of those things. But let me. I think let's talk about the overall outlook to begin with. And yeah, let me come to you first on that if I can. And let me start with inflation, because we had the OBR forecast of inflation above 4% for the coming 12 months. How great a worry is that for you? And did the Chancellor, in your view, do enough to feel that we're on the safe side of a calculation about the inflationary risk?
Well, I mean, it was interesting that the Chancellor was actually covering it in a budget, given that it's not really part of the public finances. And as he said, he doesn't have that much that he can do to influence that that outcome, because a lot of it is down to COVID and the emergence from the pandemic, as well as it's a global phenomenon related to supply chain, etc. So not much that he can do. He did a little bit in terms of the easing of the deduction from universal credit. So there was something there for working households, and the assumption is now that as we have such a tight labor market, that people who want the protection can do it via work. I guess that was his assumption. But overall, I mean, we're not particularly worried about inflation in the sense that we think this will be a short to medium term issue for businesses and for households that will potentially go back to the target, the Bank of England target, even as early as the end of next year. But we do still have another year to deal with higher prices, and the real worry is whether inflation expectations are going to be embedding higher inflation, and would that lead to higher interest rates than what we would have had, and that would obviously have implication for costs for households as well as for the cost of public finances. Apart from the fact that inflation now is impacting public finances via the index-linked bond. So overall, it is an issue that the Chancellor needs to look at in some way, but it's not the major problem that we have in the economy, as Rain mentioned earlier on. It is much more about future growth and productivity, and how we can grow faster in a sustainable way going forward.
And we'll certainly come on to those things, of course. But before we do, Anna, let me just touch on inflation with you, because I think it is a concern out in the country. The Chancellor's quite clear this is driven, I think, as Yael was saying, by really two factors: the sort of growing pains of the global economy reopening, and by energy prices. And that's why, in his view, it sort of finds its way out of the system, sooner rather than later. Are you as optimistic as he is?
Well, I think there are these global forces at play, but really looking forwards, in order to avoid getting into an inflationary spiral, we do need to really focus on productivity, because if there isn't that capacity in the economy through the investment in skills, capital, innovation, infrastructure, then we're going to struggle to actually keep that inflation at bay. So that's why it's even more crucial right now, given that fact.
Yeah, and there seemed to be early in the budget statement, when the Chancellor went out of his way to sort of pay tribute to the effectiveness of the Bank of England as an agent of controlling inflation, there seemed to be a nod there to the Governor of Bank of England that it was okay to go ahead and raise rates. Are you now expecting, Anna, that we might get a rate rise in as soon as December?
Well, I mean, that's not my expertise in terms of monetary policy, but I think whenever there's a situation of rising inflation and expectations of rising inflation, it's fair to assume that interest rates are going to be going up as well. And, interest rates are currently very low. So probably a slight raise wouldn't have massive negative impacts. But of course, there are impacts in terms of mortgages, in terms of business investment. So there are dangers with respect to inflation and interest rates going up too.
Ray, if you'd still been working at the bank, would you have read what Rishi Sunak said yesterday as an opportunity or an open door to raise rates in December, if that's what he wanted to do?
Well, if I were still at the bank, and the bank will always say they are very independent from the Treasury, and the Treasury's job is to set fiscal policy. The Bank of England is to tackle inflation, and I think Rishi Sunak actually articulated that very well. He sort of said, look, it's the bank's job to tackle inflation. I'm sure they're on it. I think what we've seen over the course of the autumn is the rhetoric and some of the language from the Bank of England is starting to strengthen. And I think they are really starting to really try and signal that they take inflation seriously, that they are concerned by some of the outturns we're seeing. It's generally some of the real pressures on inflation are still in particular areas. It's supply shortages on specific components. You can see that in producer prices, and also around energy prices, right? That we've seen some real spikes recently. And the challenge the Bank of England has is, how much of some of those are really like temporary mismatch between demand and supply in particular pockets of the economy, and how much could this turn into a more generalized situation where inflation is going up, people's wages are going up, you get into this sort of wage price spiral that becomes embedded. And I think the bit that the Bank of England will be most concerned about is where you start to see inflationary expectations start ticking up. And that's why I think we probably will see them act. Maybe not as soon as November. I think we'll see some strong language at their meeting shortly in November, but probably that first move in February. But it's still going to be really modest, right? Most economists think we might see maybe 2 interest rate rises over the course of next year. So it's very different to where we were in the 70s. And also the current levels of inflation are at a very different level from where we were then. And as I think Yael was saying, most of the pressures we're seeing are seen as transitory and not leading to a very permanent increase in the overall level of inflation over the long term.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, let me come back to you, because you're quite rightly steering us towards the big question of growth, which I think is the key to sort of the economic future of this country. The figures the Chancellor gave yesterday from the OBR suggested that after this spurt, we're going to get back to some pretty sort of, drab sort of levels of growth, 1.2, 1.3% a year, a couple of years from now. Do you share those expectations that those are the kind of levels of growth that we're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, and we probably do need to put all of this in perspective, because we are experiencing very strong rates of growth, but they are due to a very sharp contraction we had earlier. So it's great news that we've managed to come out of this recession so quickly and potentially go back to pre-COVID levels relatively fast for a recession. But that's partially because also the nature of the shock, and also the nature of the assistance that the government gave, especially in the form of the furlough scheme, etc. So all of that is great, but it doesn't mean that we have great growth potential in the UK. It was just a rebound, and now we're going to go back to reality, if you like, and that reality is going to be coupled with a very significant increase in taxation, in corporate tax, as well as national insurance contribution, etc. So the tax burden is going to go up, just as we're coming back to normal, if you like. And the big question is, how are we going to get our mojo back in a more permanent level and get growth going, get the dynamics moving, while dealing with the new relationship with the EU, which is our biggest market, and dealing with quite significant structural change, which represent quite a few opportunities for us in terms of the faster adoption of technology, etc. But also we have quite a lot of mismatch, if you like, in the labor market and other things related to this big change that we'll need to deal with.
And Yael, I guess we've lost our mojo over quite a long period, and we've lost it quite badly. So we were probably never going to get it all back in one budget. But if you look at what the Chancellor did yesterday, a good beginning. How would you rate the measures that he announced yesterday that targeted growth and research and that set of things as a first step?
So I mean, I was quite surprised. I think generally the Chancellor gave more than what we thought he would. He was warning us that he's going to be quite strict on the finances, and he's going to focus on paying back the debt while not making it an austerity budget. And I think generally maybe he was potentially a little bit more generous in the spending review than we predicted. But overall, there wasn't much on. I don't think there was a lot of big money on certain key themes, like, for example, climate change, or leveling up, or even technology and innovation. There were bits, but not that like this big vision and boost and direction, as if you like, to steer us to this new course.
Okay. Anna, how did you feel about the measures that he discussed on particularly R&D, I suppose, and skills, are perhaps the two most interesting areas?
Yeah, I mean, I would share Yael's point, which is that, we face quite a big challenge to restore productivity growth. We've had really poor productivity performance since the financial crisis in the UK, much poorer than other advanced economies. Even before Brexit, this was a massive challenge, with many of us calling for increased investment in innovation, skills, and infrastructure. Then, of course, there's the Brexit shock. And, bear in mind that although the outlook looks better in this budget, because the forecasts are better than they were previously, we're still expecting 2% lower long-term GDP due to the pandemic and 4% due to Brexit. So we've got these massive challenges facing the UK. And given that, we do face an urgent need to have a massive response, because it's only through having that productivity growth that we're going to have sustained increases in living standards and avoid all those inflationary pressures that we mentioned. So I think that the commitment to R&D is crucial. But remember, this was already, back in 2020, there was a commitment to get to 22 billion by 2024 spending on R&D. And now that's actually 20 billion. So it's a massive increase, but it's not as much as was previously committed. And in some sense, that might make it harder for us to reach the target of 2.4% R&D as a share of GDP by 2027. But R&D, the amount is important, but also the direction is important, as Yael said as well. So how is that money spent? And that's why you need actually a complementary set of policies, incentives, investments across the board to try and steer innovation towards the things that we know we need, whether it's productivity enhancing technologies that can enhance workers and complement them rather than just simply replace them, and whether it's clean technologies that can actually help us solve the climate crisis. The UK is a very innovative economy. We actually have power to work at that innovation frontier globally and help solve these challenges, but also then economically benefit along the way, because the markets for such goods and services will grow, so we can actually access growth opportunities through those.
Yeah, and Anna, one of the things I'm never quite sure about is how much weight I should give to government investment in R&D. I see the figures about the amount of private money that's pouring into tech in London, for example, which is quite extraordinary. And I wonder sometimes whether we over-index government spending when there's so much private money coming in anyway.
Well, I think there's actually very strong evidence that public R&D crowds in private sector R&D. This is due to innovation spillovers. This is due to confidence and direction of travel that then the private sector knows this is a growth area to continue investing in, particularly in areas where the technological solutions are unclear and long-term research is needed. That's where there's a real role for looking at research as a public good that government should help provide. And we've seen that in the development of the internet, and we've seen it in our ability to respond with vaccines, which really benefited from long periods of publicly funded research.
Okay, great. Ray, let me come back to you, because I've been part of quite a number of CBI conversations about skills gaps, digital skills gaps, a whole range of things. Can you just remind us what the Chancellor said yesterday about those skills gaps and what measures were announced in the budget to address skills, and how they measure up against the kind of things that you've been looking for?
So we did see some announcements on skills, but I'd say it was a mixed bag. There was still, I think, a missed opportunity to really think about adult lifelong learning. So he talked about his skills boot camp. So that's where it's sort of sector based. It's really focused on areas where there are sort of skill shortages, and equally where there are people who've been in a period of unemployment, and trying to really have agile methods of giving sort of on-the-job training. So he really wants to quadruple the amount of places available on the skills boot camps, and this is sort of modeled on programs that have been run successfully in the US, and I know the Chancellor is particularly proud of that initiative. But I think there's a question as to whether that is really the scale of what we need, given we know so many so many of us will need more retraining as we're all living and working longer. He also talked about rolling out T levels, so that's a sort of trying to have technical qualifications that are on a par with A levels, and kind of increasing places for over 100,000 16 to 19-year-olds on that T level scheme by the end of 23-24. And those T levels are in partnership with industry. So everyone who completes a T level will do a placement in industry. So that will be an opportunity for businesses to really engage with that system. And that was something actually that Philip Hammond came up with, and we were supportive when it was first announced. And this is trying to develop it further. And actually, when we met with the Chancellor, he talked about you know, there has been a bit of a gap in funding, particularly for that age 16 to 19. The education budget has been protected per pupil, but that's been for the below age 16 cohort. So I think it was right that he identified that. But I think where we feel there are real gaps is, you know, the apprenticeship levy, will come back to that. I think we'll always be saying we'd like to see more flexibility in that system, so it's easier for businesses to use it to train people in where they're seeing real skills gaps, and for individuals so that they can retrain as well. That's really important. And at the moment, the apprenticeship system and the levy system that goes alongside it is just too rigid to be sort of flexible and for a modern workplace. And more broadly, you know, we also had a proposal around individual training accounts, so really taking long-term people who've been out of employment for a period of 6 months or so, and making sure that they've got access to courses, to a whole range of training. And we think we should have that for, you know, all adults in the UK, and you scale it, and it's grant funding for those who haven't had training since they left high school. I think we could be thinking bigger, right, and having bigger schemes available. So that's where we think there was a bit of a missed opportunity around skills in general.
Yeah, and Rain, how much do you think of the spending on education as being of a piece with that? Because we'll get back to 2010 levels of spending on education in about 2025, I think. But that's 15 years with no growth in spending on education in this country. That's quite a difficult backdrop if you're then expecting those to produce the skilled workforce, you know, from 2025 onwards.
Yeah, and I think like there's a balance between thinking, you know, how much of that training do you do at, you know, in school, and how much should that be helping people throughout their working lives? And I think that's one, you know, our view is there's a real gap on how we spend on individuals throughout their working lives. And I think, you know, we did work on McKinsey's, and I think 50% of people on the lowest income, so that bottom 20% of the income distribution, have had no training since they left high school. So I agree that there, you know, if you look at the overall spending per pupil, you know, bringing it back to 2010 levels may not be a huge achievement, but I think we also have an issue about adult lifelong learning. But I think one of the areas where, as economists, we would step back and think about the pandemic, originally we were most concerned about high unemployment and what that might mean over the longer term. And I think in a really positive way, we don't think we're going to see some really long-term scarring in the labor market in the same way, because of higher unemployment, and particularly amongst young people. But on the other side, I think what we will see scarring effects is actually education, and particularly those who missed out on education when schools were closed. We know that hits those in lower income households harder. Those parents were more likely to have to be going out to work, much less likely to have easy digital resources at home, or be able to afford extra or catch up learning for their kids at home. And so that will lead to higher inequality. And I think some of that catch up spending, the Chancellor did announce some more. I think it was about 1.4 billion for schools to help with some of that catch up funding, but it was a lot lower than what was recommended by some of the education advisors. And I think over the longer term, that's where we could see some of the real scarring from this pandemic.
Yeah. Okay. Yael, can I come back to you with quite a broad question that's come in anonymously? Someone who is worried, what's the likelihood of a repeat that we once, on the question of growth, that we once again become, in inverted commas, the poor man of Europe, as comparable economies grow much faster than we do and leave us behind? If you look across Europe, is that on the cards?
Well, Europe is not one country, and you have quite a lot of different growth there. And also, I think one thing to bear in mind also is that it's not just the growth, it's just also the level and what stage your economy is at. So you have certain economies that are a little bit more, if you like, developed, more mature, they tend to grow less fast, and other economies that still have more catch up to do. And within Europe, we have a mix of that. So I'd say UK generally tends to grow growth tends to be relatively good, you know, well. This is not the bad compared to other European economies. I wouldn't necessarily look at European economies as our benchmark for quite a lot of things in terms of economic performance. But I mean, just the thinking about Europe, we will have a challenge that it will be more significant for us than for most other European economies, where we need to adapt to a new relationship with Europe that will impact us materially more than the majority of the others. And we would expect supply chains that are very, very strongly linked at the moment to be refigured over the next few years. We had a little bit of a lull because everyone was focused on the immediate and on COVID, etc. But now that things are opening up, we are likely to see quite a lot of change there, and that is still it is probably likely to impact UK more, because we will be losing some of that influence, positive influence on productivity from those links.
Great, thanks, Yael. Rain, can I just come back to you with quite a specific question from Charles Trotman, who's on the question of regional funding. He's looking at the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, where the Red Book says it's going to take 2 years before the UK matches previous EU funding levels of £1.5 billion. And Charles says for the spending review period, that's a shortfall of nearly £2 billion, which will have a negative impact on UK regions. Are you concerned about the level of sort of regional funding within the announcements yesterday?
Yeah, so it was, I mean, I'd say broadly, it was pretty silent on levelling up, right? I don't think it was a sort of budget that really set out, you know, this is our plan for levelling up, and this is, you know, the economic levers we're going to use to really address and raise productivity and standard of living in areas of the UK where it's generally lagged the average. There wasn't that sort of plan. We are expecting the levelling up paper imminently, where hopefully we will see some of those announcements. And I know I don't recall seeing specifics around the Shared Prosperity Fund and how much was allocated in the budget, but I think he's right to point out that that has been an area that we've always sort of said, look, the Shared Prosperity Fund has to replace has to cover at least the loss in regional development funding that areas would have received through our membership of the EU. So I think it is an area that definitely needs to be looked at. And I think one of the other areas that there were some announcements on rail that kind of preceded the budget, and I think again there we thought there wasn't enough allocated to some of the connectivity we need to see, particularly around Northern Rail between that east-west connectivity. So I would say it's still, you know, the levelling up plan just still doesn't seem to be there. I mean, Andy Haldane has been appointed, I think, primarily to try and come up with some of the hard economic policies we'll need to see to deliver, but it still feels like the plan that hasn't yet been rolled out by this government.
And I think, Anna, one of your reflections on the budget overall was that it didn't have that kind of joined up character to it. I thought it was amazing that the levelling up agenda didn't get more attention than it did. The green agenda seemed pretty absent as well. Did it feel like a sort of nicely put together piece of clockwork, or is there still work to do to try to make it holistic?
Yeah, I think we still don't have a really coordinated set of policies here. I mean, you know, two widely cited examples of how this is not consistent with a net zero strategy is the freeze on domestic air duty and the continued freeze on fuel duties, both of which, you know, we're hosting COP26 next week. All eyes are on us, and these are clearly policies that are not going to stimulate the kind of behaviour change that we know we need. And actually, we know that in this next phase of decarbonisation in the UK, behaviour change is massively important, much more so than in the past. So those are two examples. You know, at the same time, France have been actually closing down domestic air routes where there are trains that can kind of do things faster or quickly. So I think we've got to really have this holistic view, and it really goes to levelling up as well. And skills are absolutely fundamental across all of this. You know, if you had to choose one thing, if you invest in human capital, it improves people's outcomes in life, social mobility. Having more skilled workers is complementary with having better technology adoption, management practices, and therefore productivity. We need new skills in the transition to net zero. We need skills as a fundamental way of actually attacking these regional inequalities that we see. So, you know, as Rain said, I think we need to see much more on that, and there are real concerns about the uneven impacts in terms of educational scoring during the pandemic, and there were already massive gaps before that. So this is really an area we need to focus on.
Yeah.
Yael, to come back to you on the growth question, are there things that you can see that are not necessarily within the Chancellor's remit, but might spring from lockdown and the sort of disruption to working practices that we saw there, that might of their own accord organically increase productivity anyway, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is quite exciting. We are living in an exciting period where we are seeing this shift in the way people work. A lot of people work and interact and shop, etc. And that increased adoption of technology could see a rise in productivity. I mean, just to give you an example, we spend much less time now traveling for work than we did, and potentially much more careful about our meetings, etc. Some of it we want to get back to, because you have all these symbiosis of learning and exchanging ideas. We want that, and that is really helpful for productivity. But it gave us an opportunity to really pause and think, are we doing things the best way? And I think this new era, once COVID is over, would allow us to rethink the way we work and potentially become more productive as a result of it, and use that time that any investment we made in adapting to technology, new technologies, use it in the future as well. So I'm quite optimistic in that sense. I think also we had this realization as a nation, and not just in the UK actually, that we have more broader values, and climate change and net zero is definitely something that came up. And I think that has a potential to improve productivity as well if we incorporate it in the right way.
Okay, Anna, the things that Yael is describing happened organically, nothing to do with government. They were responses as individuals and of companies to the pandemic and to lockdown. But looking forwards, do you see a role for government in trying to work out where the productivity gains might come from those things, and enabling those to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue is that businesses were pushed into adopting new technologies and reorganizing their businesses by the nature of the crisis we faced. But businesses face a number of barriers to technology adoption and organizational change. And while some of those might have been overcome in the short term, many of those barriers will remain. So businesses consistently cite financing constraints as a barrier to investing in new technologies. And actually, in our most recent survey with the CBI that we've done in collaboration, which we'll be releasing soon, we've seen a rise in skills constraints. And this could be either reflecting the general skills environment, or it could also be that because businesses have actually adopted more technologies and got a little bit further along that journey, they're now realizing there are specific skill sets that they need. So again, you know, there are lots of things, whether it's the broadband infrastructure, whether it's information, whether it's tax incentives for some of this kind of investment. You know, we've seen the R&D tax credits were expanded for cloud computing and data, for example, or whether it's skills policies, as we've discussed at length. There's a lot government can do to try and actually leverage this opportunity that we have from the changes that companies have made, and try and make sure that that leads to a more innovative trajectory rather than just being a kind of one-off.
Yeah, Ray, let me come back to you, because you mentioned that unemployment, which again, you know, is a figure that's referenced in the budget rather than a sort of fundamental aspect of it. But it is extraordinary, isn't it, that unemployment didn't go higher than it did. I mean, it peaked. You know, the forecast is it's going to peak at half of what some people thought a level it might reach. Which is what happened there? Do you think?
Well, I think it was partly the success of the government schemes that were put in place, and if I do say, look, my dog agrees. If I do say so, you know, partly I think some of the work that we did with the Treasury alongside the trade unions and other business organisations to have the flexibility within those schemes. So I think, look, the furlough scheme has really done its job. I think it's right that it's, you know, now come to an end, because we can see, you know, vacancies in the UK economy are at historic highs. But I think it really was able to protect people's jobs in that period when businesses were closed. So I think it really, and I think no one was quite sure what would happen to spending as the economy reopened. And we've seen some of it moderate more recently, and consumer confidence has started to come back. But as the economy reopened, people have been out and spending, have been to shops and restaurants and all those sorts of things that we've been missing. So that we've seen sort of stronger demand as the economy has reopened, and that's been creating jobs. So you know, in a way, we're lucky that you know, that's been in place. But I think, I guess, just to add a bit to what Anna and Yael was saying in terms of where I think the budget did sort of miss an opportunity was particularly around greening the tax system, and thinking about that transition to a low carbon economy. I expected to hear more around heat and decarbonisation and some of those areas, and we've seen some signals in the net zero review, but I think you know, we're going to need to work hard for the budget in March to make sure that we see some of those policies implemented at speed.
Okay, Rain, thank you. I think when you talk about those missed opportunities, you should probably refer to them as dogs that didn't bark, shouldn't you? It would be consistent.
That would be appropriate.
Yeah, let me. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I just want to go back to the sort of big picture where we started, because if I look 3-5 years out, based on what the Chancellor said yesterday, then what I'm seeing is low growth. I'm seeing very low increases in household incomes, and I'm seeing consistently relatively high tax for this country. In terms of a business environment, that doesn't look to me tremendously promising. What's your sort of medium long-term view of how things look?
So I think generally, if you look at the growth outlook, we just need to put it in perspective. It's not that much worse than what it was going to be prior to the pandemic in terms of the overall growth. We had a problem since the Great Recession previously, where productivity fell quite significantly. We need to get back and resolve that. So we're kind of going back with a much bigger burden of debt that the Chancellor is working quite hard to try and reduce it and make public finances more sustainable. So overall, we are going to see higher burden of debt, and we are going to see probably a tougher business environment as a result of it. But also, I'd say what we've learned from this crisis is that when it's needed, the government can actually step in and do more. And that's also quite important. And rates are likely to remain low for a long time, even though they're going up. So there will be some scope for government to step in and make those investments that we've been talking about that are still missing, and reforms to the tax system, etc., that are still missing to drive us through a faster growth path.
Okay, we're sort of out of time, but Anna, let me just come back to you very quickly on that sort of medium long-term picture. How does it look to you?
I mean, I would share those same views. I think the productivity problem is still there, and let's try and use the opportunity from changes in organizational practices and technology adoption to actually improve that productivity. Also, the spread of productivity across the country, which we know is uneven. I'm also looking towards the Levelling Up white paper in terms of what's going to actually concretely be offered there. It has to be more than just money spent on particular infrastructure projects. It has to involve more local control and that fundamental skills investment as well.
Right, okay. Yael, Anna, Rain, thank you all very much indeed. It's been fascinating and incredibly useful to me, at least I'm sure to everybody else. My memory tells me that we are taking a break from these webinars for the next couple of weeks for the duration of COP. but there will be some special events hosted by the CBI in conjunction with Tortoise from COP itself, so do look out for those. But thanks for your company today. Thanks for everyone who's participated. Thanks for your questions, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon indeed. Bye for now.